what is church autonomy?
Well, it's very much a central part of our right to freedom of religion. And our courts have always held the view that the judiciary, and obviously by extension Parliament, should not involve itself or pronounce upon the internal matters. That's what church autonomy is. It's the alternative, it's the internal matters of a religious association. And this is often referred to as the doctrine of entanglement. It was very importantly confirmed relatively recently in a Supreme Court of Appeal judgment in the matter of De Lange, who was a Methodist minister who basically at some point decided that she wanted to marry publicly her same-sex partner and also to obviously then continue in ministry. And they said that no, she could not, because there had obviously been internal let's say, doctrines that had been agreed upon and that she was well aware of, that this was not part of the tenets or the faith beliefs of the Methodist Church. And the court essentially said that you could not interfere with the internal, let's say, organizational and tenets of faith of a religious organization without fundamentally infringing upon their religious freedom right. Because obviously if you can dictate what they should or should not do by bringing in some alternative standard, then there goes your religious freedom. So as the main dispute in this matter was considered to be the internal rules of the church, as far as possible, this should always then be determined domestically, if you like, without interference from a court. And the court should only ever become involved in this sort of dispute if it's strictly necessary to do so. But even then, it should refrain from determining doctrinal issues. Obviously, this would be the proper respect for freedom of religion.
Michael, just I don't want to belabor the point, but is religious autonomy important? And if so, why?
Well, yes, I mean, the Constitution in Section 31 and also international law specifically recognize that the right to religious freedom is not just limited to individuals, but it obviously extends collectively to religious communities and associations. And obviously, communities are necessary because that is often how individuals will express their religious freedom rights. They express them in the community. They express them in assemblies. We have church public services and that type of thing. Yeah. So the Constitution, yes, it does protect the rights of religious communities to practice their religion, to form, to join, to maintain religious associations. And also that would extend, of course, to faith-based schools, for example, which also have the same autonomy, shall we say. And so, yes, it is irrevocably intertwined with other rights as well, such as dignity and equality, freedom of expression and freedom of association.
Excellent, Michael. I buy into the autonomy of the church, and so you're speaking to the choir here. If we had to think of a threat to the autonomy of the church, I've often spoken about state regulation of religion. Maybe you could offer a definition of what is state regulation of religion.
Well, essentially, it's any means by which the state would interfere with a religious group's operations or even individuals' decisions or their ability to practice a religion. And it includes official rights and policies that maybe the state is promoting. That would very much include government favoritism, like, for example, subsidies or privileges that might be awarded to a certain religion. But it also includes, very importantly, restrictions that might be imposed by government agencies. So in a nutshell, it comes down to the state deciding who can have a church or a mosque or whatever it may be, and which religions or specific religious expressions or practices are allowed and which are not. Any of those things will be obviously state regulation of religion.
Michael, we live in South Africa. We have a constitutional democracy. Our constitution guarantees us the right to religious freedom. How on earth is state regulation of religion justified? And how are these justifications even valid?
Well, often what you see, and it's quite a pattern, in fact, is that there'll be some highlighting of some abuse or malpractice that is taking place, typically in the fringe elements of a religious sector. You know, the sort of charlatans who dupe people out of their money, or you might remember the prophet of doom, for example, who sprayed insecticide in somebody's faith. And generally speaking, there's the implication, it's hyped up in the media, that this is just representative of how everybody in the faith community may very well, if we're not watching, operate, which of course is fundamentally untrue. And then again, sometimes the argument is made to, in some way, try to protect doctrinal orthodoxy. And another claim is that it needs to be perhaps regulated because it's like a profession, like accounting or like lawyers or something. But obviously, these concerns, although serious and valid, aren't solved through state regulation of religion. And when we argued this, and we have argued this over a 5-year period, when the CRL Rights Commission came out with a report, and there was then a parliamentary inquiry into that, there is a comprehensive body of legislation and common law that covers all these areas of abuse. And we always say, you cannot commit a crime and somehow try to cloak it with religious freedom. A crime is a crime is a crime. There's no such thing as like a spiritual crime, for example. I mean, any crime, whether it's a politician, a pastor, or a postman, a crime is a crime is a crime. And then, of course, as I mentioned, it's unconstitutional, because if the state starts to try to interfere and to enforce some form of religious orthodoxy, well, almost certainly that's going to infringe on religious freedom rights. You cannot have, we don't have like a state church in South Africa, and nor should we, for that matter. And of course, the other element of it is it is often unworkable, because imagine, you have to now police whatever there is. I mean, I understand that there's, say, 250,000 churches and mosques and temples in South Africa, at least. Imagine how many people would therefore qualify as religious practitioners if you wanted to license them as well, which they were proposing. You might be upwards of 1 million people. And where do you stop? Is a cell group leader a religious practitioner? Is a worship leader a children's church pastor? I mean, the list goes on and on. So really, it is actually putting a Band-Aid over something. What you should be doing is you should be looking at the application of existing law, because the law applies, as I said, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are, and we must be law-abiding, and we should have no problem being law-abiding. So the enforcement of existing laws is often what is not happening when you start seeing some of these abuses. And then you have to ask the question, well, why are they then allowed to continue? And often that's a lack of capacity, perhaps, or even a lack of political will.
Michael, maybe take us even a little bit deeper. Give us general or in principle examples or defense in terms of why state regulation is problematic in South Africa.
Well, I mean, history is replete with terrible examples. In fact, one of the reasons why we have religious freedom enshrined in, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is because for centuries, what you had a particular form of expression of let's say, the Christian faith in Europe. Let's talk about that specifically. Yes. So, I'm sure from your church history that Martin Luther came along, and up until that point, you only really had one single type expression of the Christian faith, which was the Catholic Church. And when he came up with his, let's say, alternatives, his Protestant, as they were called, heresies, then what happened was that the full weight of the state, which was in that instance the Holy Roman Empire and others, came down upon him. But he was then protected by another political entity, by the Prussian states. And that literally caused war. There were nearly 200 years of bloody warfare that took place in Europe, where literally, hundreds of thousands of people died. The problem is this, of course, and this is the interesting pattern, that whenever the state puts its political weight behind any religion or even ideology, because an ideology is also a belief system, it's a type of faith, it always ends horribly for someone. So, you'd have thought the Lutherans, once they had established themselves, which they did, of course, in Germany, in the German states, and in Switzerland and so on, that they would be very tolerant. Not at all, because the next expression of the Christian faith that came about was the Anabaptists, and the Lutherans dealt with the Anabaptists as brutally as they had been dealt with themselves. You have another instance where you see the Puritans, the Pilgrim Fathers, getting on the Mayflower and going across to America to escape persecution. And then they establish their colonies in Massachusetts. And then along comes another group called the Quakers, who had a different interpretation or expression of Christianity. And again, the Puritans then ruthlessly persecuted the Quakers. And in fact, we have on October the 27th, International Religious Freedom Day, which actually commemorates when 4 Quakers were actually hung in the state of Massachusetts because of their faith. So you can see that as soon as you get the state backing an ideology, it ends horribly for someone. And that is why we must be so careful to actually stop this entanglement, as it's called, taking place, to stop the state from interfering with religious freedom rights. Because as soon as they back anybody or any strand or any particular expression or ideology, someone's going to end up really in a very bad space.
Absolutely, Michael. Even as you're talking, my own church history comes from both an Anabaptist strand and from a Puritan strand. So I'm keenly aware of those two instances of religious tension between the state and religion. And you know what happened in England. You know, in terms of Baptists, we kind of hold dear John Bunyan, the writer of Pilgrim's Progress, spent many years in London,
Yes.
Tower, and basically that was for the faith. And even on South African shores, you think of the French Huguenots, they arrived for exactly the same reason, and that was a state sponsored purge that was happening in France. But maybe let's move on from distant history and talk about nearer history. Have there been attempts to regulate religion in South Africa? And if so, what's the outcome?
Yeah, well, I briefly mentioned earlier the Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights Commission, known as the CRL, which is, of course, an institution of state. It's established by the South African Constitution, specifically, by the way, to protect and promote the rights of, among other things, religion. And they issued a report entitled The Commercialization of Religion and the Abuse of People's Belief Systems. And this was back in 2015. And what they proposed was that there would be now a system, which they said was a peer review mechanism, which would establish, for example, a group of people who would then oversee the Christian faith. And they would decide basically who was or was not a good representation of that faith, both, I suppose, from a behavioral and a doctrinal point of view. But of course, again, as soon as you do that, that must be state regulation of religion, because the question is who appoints those people, and what if you disagree with them? Or what if they disagree with you? And of course, the idea of licensing all religious practitioners and places of worship is deeply problematic, because as soon as you cut somebody out, you know, the Constitutional Court has ruled that even if a belief is bizarre, irrational, illogical, and incapable of scientific proof, it is still protected by religious freedom. And of course, one of the problems, particularly in that instance, was that the CRL were themselves saying that they would be the final arbiter of religion, and they would have the final decision powers regarding any dispute in the religious community. Well, that's state regulation of religion. And thankfully, this was seen for what it was, which was an overreach. And the South African Parliament, when they held their inquiry into it, basically confirmed that the religious sector is self-regulatory in South Africa. Yes, we must be law-abiding. Yes, we must be compliant. You know, as I said, you cannot cloak some unlawful or illegal act under this sort of religious freedom cloak. But certainly there should not be, and there never should have been, frankly, any attempt to interfere with whether or not somebody's preaching something that may or may not seem orthodox or correct to somebody else. You know, to give you an instance, the last statistic I heard was that in the world today, there are 55,000 different Christian denominations. That should give you a pretty good indication that there's no such thing as complete orthodoxy across the board.
Absolutely. Whilst Baptists, by way of example, might be a homogeneous theological group in South Africa. The truth is that every single Baptist church is a fully autonomous local entity. We're non-denominational. We don't have a denomination. How on earth would we be policed? We might bind together in free will association, but we're not going to allow free will association to dictate into local churches. That's just opposite of Baptist ethos. And I would imagine that many of the denominations that associate or came historically from Baptist backgrounds, whether they be our Reformed charismatic brothers and sisters or Pentecostal friends across the way or whatever else it might be, many hold a similar ecclesiology in terms of how the church is structured. And so it was never going to work. So what you're saying is relatively good news. Michael, maybe we can go back to where we started when I introduced the topic. We spoke about African countries and just this a couple of news articles that I've been seeing over the last couple of months, where it seems that whilst this may have been settled in South Africa, or at least for a moment, it may have been settled in South Africa. What's going on further afield? What's going on the African continent right now?
Well, some countries in Africa have actually addressed this problem. They have imposed state regulation of religion, and you can see how badly that goes. So, for example, in Rwanda, one of the things that they put in place in order to qualify as a religious practitioner or a pastor is that you have to have a certain academic or theological qualification before you actually can pastor a church. Now, by that definition, all the apostles that the Lord Jesus Christ himself selected would have been disqualified. The book of Acts records that according to the so-called religious leadership of the day, that would have been that peer review mechanism that would have been evaluating them, they were seen as ignorant and unlearned. The only thing they, of course, noticed was that they'd been with Jesus. And I think it goes back to the fact that, yes, it's good to educate your calling as a pastor, but I don't think any pastor would say that they qualified and then they were called. Almost every pastor that I've ever met was called, and then they qualify their calling, if you like, by studying theology or what have you. And it's obviously good to do that, clearly. But in Rwanda, they've literally shut down, not just churches, by the way, but literally thousands of churches and mosques as well, and go to the same place. Unless you have a certain membership, they won't recognize. You have to have, I think it's 100,000 signed up members before they'll even recognize you. So, clearly that is oppressive in terms of, your religious freedom, right? In other countries, they're now considering it. So Kenya, similar situation, terrible, terrible thing. 400 people were apparently brainwashed into starving themselves to death by some rural pastor. And of course, the solution is we must clamp down on this. We must clamp down on this. In Uganda, they're considering it too. In Namibia, they're considering it too. So these are very concerning. And again, it's not that you don't deal with the issues, but the solution is not to give the state the power to decide who can and cannot preach, or who can or cannot form a religious organization, or what they can and cannot say. That is not freedom of religion. That is actually the death of freedom of religion.
Look, I do want to come in because you've spoken, you've touched on some topics that are so relevant, and people that are listening in will be aware of them. I mean, we spoke about the doom pastor in South Africa. You hear of pastors and pyramid schemes in South Africa. You hear of, foreign nationals fleecing local residents and, getting on their jets and going back to Malawi or wherever it might be. There is a very real problem within the context of the church. But if I'm reading you correctly, Michael, and if I am, I'm in agreement, the solution is twofold. One is the church needs to be self-regulating. The church needs to be speaking out against the abuses that we see. When we see abuse happening, whether that be theological abuse or whether that be actual practical abuse, we need to have a prophetic voice in in our society, in our country, and we need to speak to these issues. But where there have been crimes that have been committed, real crimes, people have actually been wronged, well, we need to make sure that we are taking these to court and they are being dealt with. And so the state bears responsibility where crime has been committed to bring those criminals to book, and where orthodox matters of church are being abused, the church has a responsibility to speak to these things. Have I understood you correctly, Michael?
No, 100%. And I think, one of the things that perhaps came out of the CRL process was that many, many networks of churches were formed. And of course, that's a voluntary association, but it does bring a level of accountability. And that's a good thing. And also, as you say, churches, they function, they operate, mosques as well, all the religious organizations, they operate in a local community. And people know full well when something weird and crazy is happening next door. And yes, it should be addressed. But as I say, to look at these abuses that take place, we analyzed the CRL's report in detail, and they listed multiple abuses. And we went through and found that there was, in fact, an existing law for every single abuse that we saw. I've actually never yet seen one of these so-called spiritual abuses that actually isn't already a criminal or at least a civil legal matter. So the question is always about enforcement. And again, giving somebody a license or not, that just puts a band-aid on it at best. But it is unnecessary, it's unconstitutional, and again, to be avoided, because you cannot have the state entangling itself in the internal workings of a church and what they preach, teach, how the membership takes place, unless it goes beyond that and starts to become something that is illegal and unlawful. And then, of course, the state actually has a duty to intervene.
Michael, 4SA has flown such an excellent flag on this issue as you've engaged with the CRL, as you've engaged with the state on behalf of the churches, on behalf of religious freedom in South Africa, but really representing what is our case before the CRL, before the state, and making sure that you've advocated well for us. This last question that I have for you seems almost redundant, but how does freedom of religion ensure the church or religious autonomy remains protected in South Africa?
Well, I think particularly by supporting organizations, particularly 4SA. We have been very vigilant on multiple levels to make sure that the autonomy of the church is protected. There have been different pieces of legislation through the years as well, where it's been potentially, the state has been trying to give itself the power to, say, amend the constitution of a church or that sort of thing. And we've been involved in faith-based schools and that type of thing as well. So yes, we have to be vigilant. It's like any right that you have, it's only as valid as your willingness to actually stand upon it. And that's what 4SA exists to do. We have, for the last 10 years, upheld and been running to the defense of religious freedom wherever we've seen that there's a possible erosion of it, because that is the foundational human right, if you like. That is foundational to our ability, particularly as Christians, to not only just believe, but to live out, to express freely without fear of sanction by the state or anyone else for that matter, our faith. That is how the Great Commission is accomplished. That is how we basically pass on our views to our children. And that is how we, in turn, really celebrate the dignity that our faith gives us.
Michael, I want to say thank you for all the work that you guys do. You really do work tirelessly behind the scenes, and I'm very grateful for the work that 4SA does. I do want to point any people that are listening to the 4SA website. That's 4SA, forsa.org.za. And on the 4SA website, there is tons of information, videos, articles. You can sign up to a newsletter, and there is information on how you can partner financially with 4SA, and I'd encourage listeners to do so. You can also follow 4SA on YouTube and on Facebook. Have I missed anything?
Yes.
Michael?
But you've missed nothing.
Well, just freedom of religion is such an important right to us as South Africans. And it's important that those who can partner with those that are doing work on the coalface. So, Michael, thank you to you and to your team for the work that you are doing. Every blessing to you and strength to your arm, brother.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate these chats.